Yo, guys, welcome back in today. Today, we're going to be talking about the Great African American Migration. The Great African American Migration was a massive move from the South. From 1880 to 1950, African Americans would migrate to the East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast in greater numbers. This was due to racial divisions in the South and lack of opportunities for a better life. Hundreds of years of buildup, the Jim Crow South era, and numerous documented killings of blacks in the South would lead to a massive move. Before this time, majority of African Americans lived in the South. In modern day, almost half of the population lives in the West, Midwest, and East Coast. Such events like the killings of Medgar Evers in Mississippi, Governor George Wallace blocking black students at the University of Alabama, and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, would help fuel this massive move. Restrictions, killings, low-paid jobs, no-paid jobs, lynchings, and racial division all were normal in the South. Most people who left to the North made it a point to get to the North and never come back to the South again. They would risk everything they knew to live in a new environment in sometimes uncharted areas in the United States. Many times, they would not have enough and had to struggle to get to the North, sometimes even losing their life on the way. At this point, there was no difference between refugees in a different country and in the United States. Over 6 million African Americans would move over 80 years of time. In the 1930s, 1/10 of the black population had relocated to the North. Many occasions would see families buy land in parts of the United States before they even knew the area. We must remember at the start of the migration, airplanes were not even created yet, and trains were still not around all of America yet. Debt, servitude, and sharecropping would hold back progression for many African Americans. World War I would slow down immigration to the northern part of the United States from Europe, and this would help fuel the migration due to labor shortages. Northern white companies would start to recruit African Americans from the South to work in factories, steel mills, and railroads. Southern white companies and farm owners did not like this. In the South, if a Northerner recruiter would come south to recruit blacks, they could have faced being imprisoned. One example would be in the city of Macon, Georgia, which is located in the South. To recruit and have a license in this area, a $25,000 fee, 25 local businessmen's recommendations, 10 manufacturers' recommendations, and 10 ministers were required. Authorities in the South would start to arrest blacks at railroad platforms for trying to leave or tear up their tickets when they were trying to leave. If you did make it out of the South, these three routes in these states were part of where a lot of African Americans went. If you were from Florida, the Carolinas, Virginia, or Georgia, most would go to DC, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, or Boston. The Central Path, or the Midwest, would be settled by blacks from Tennessee, Arkansas, Alabama, and Mississippi. They would go to Ohio, Missouri, Michigan, Illinois, Milwaukee, and Minnesota. The last path would be the West Coast, from Texas and Louisiana to California and other West Coast states. Of course, this is not concrete. People from the South could have went to any three of the regions, but most went to where they had family or had opportunities or where they were closest to. Legends like Muddy Waters, who is a blues legend and helped pave the way for rock and roll music, made this journey from Mississippi to Chicago in the Midwest. Though discrimination did still live in the North, African Americans over time had more freedoms and rights. Going and reading in the library would be one of them, which in Mississippi was unthinkable at the time. In the early 1900s, African Americans would begin to go to universities, express their view on life, philosophy, and high-level education. They also started in higher numbers learning about the world. The Harlem Renaissance would start a time when African Americans in New York City bloomed artistically and culturally. This is another historical time within the Great Migration. The Migration series would be 60 bright colored panels which would be made by Jacob Lawrence and are considered some of the most recognizable images of African Americans in the 1900s. All was not perfect in the North, though. Barriers and sundown towns would ban African Americans after dark. Oregon, until 1926, banned African Americans from the state. Till the 1950s, white-only signs could be seen in the store windows. With this also came the lowest paid jobs, dangerous jobs, hiring only to substitute for white strike workers, and less access to unions. Many African Americans lived in the poorest parts of the city and even had to share a single bed. When they would try to move into better neighborhoods, clauses were written into deeds that kept blacks from buying in the area. Example, by the 1910s to the 1920s, restrictive clauses ensured 85% of Chicago, Illinois off limits to African Americans in the city. In the South, many high-powered Southern company owners and politicians started to worry about the migration. African Americans were cheap labor for white Southerners and made the South rich, even though they hated them. At first, with the exiting method of African Americans picking cotton by hand, technology, and the industrial time period, white powerful Southerners were not worried overall. One politician from the South even said this: "Politically speaking, there are far too many Negroes, but from an industrial standpoint, there's room for many, many more." Over time, these feelings would change. Eventually, companies in the South tried to match wages in work environments that were offered in the North. Though, some companies tried to stop black migration to the North and the West Coast. The largest Southern steel manufacturer would refuse to cash checks sent back to the South to help blacks move to the North. Southern newspapers started to highlight only bad events that African Americans took place in the North. They also sent detectives to study and report black nationalism, wage levels, unions, and restricted train and bus access in some parts of the South. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the second wave of migrations would happen to the North, but especially to the West Coast. The nation's defense industry expanded during and after World War II. With this expansion, African Americans would help fill these jobs. Cities like Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle would see an influx of African Americans. Though the South still had its problems, as well as the North, the South had changed after the 1970s. These changes over time took off enough pressure for African Americans to not have to leave the South anymore. At one point, 90% of blacks lived in the South. It seems that the reverse is starting to occur. Since 1975, the South has shown an increase of African Americans moving back to the South. Job opportunities, lower cost of living, and warmer weather is very appeasing for African Americans from the East Coast, Midwest, and maybe in lower numbers, the West Coast. We could say this might be the beginning of a reverse migration. We will have to see in the future. So guys, today we learned about the Great African American Migration. Please like the video, turn on the bell notification down there so you'll get all my videos, and also subscribe so you can subscribe to the channel. And add me on all social medias, which is Afric Network, which is Instagram, Twitter, SoundCloud, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok. Each one teach one. Always love each other. Always learn from each other. And guys, until next time, peace. One love.